Today we have the honor of having Roderick Coover with us. It's been many months talking for him to come, so finally he's here and we're very glad about that. Roderick is an artist, American artist, very interested in flooding, so in what's happening on the historical and human side and scientific side. And I think I won't introduce you because you will do it. And he's been having an exhibition in the Centro de Arte Contemporáneo de Santa Monica. So that's how we discovered him. And now he's got a Fulbright working between France and England. So as he was in Europe, we just took the opportunity to have it here. So welcome, Roderick.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Joseph and Maria and Karine and Vanessa for all of the help in bringing me here. And my apologies that the presentation will be in English. So very briefly, part of my life is as an artist and part as a researcher. I am the director of a PhD program in documentary arts and visual research at Temple University in Philadelphia, which is a program in a film and media arts school for students who first have become masters of film but find they have research questions that exceed the arts, and they have to learn to collaborate with scientists, with humanists, with historians, with anthropologists, with geologists, with ecologists to make their next work, because the art degree is not enough. They also need research. So my program has been based on creating collaboration and to rethink paradigms of research through the arts. It's also a topic of a couple of books I've done, particularly the book Switching Codes, which is how technologies allow for dialogue between the arts, the humanities, and the sciences. How they change the language of research to imagine in a way the stories of all our fields differently. I'm also have a part-time post with the University of Bergen in electronic literature and digital narrative, and I'm particularly myself interested in this meeting point between the visual experience and the narrative, the imagined narrative, and how new technologies can open that space and give us perhaps a chance to see technology itself, the powers of technology that control so many things, the technology that is also responsible for so many of the conditions that come from paradigms that were established in the 19th century, and to look at ways to transform that language about technology, use the technology in different ways to understand perhaps the underlying logic that we live with today, a logic that has been very destructive to the planet. That is to say, I don't think we can solve the problems of climate change or mass extinction if we don't first address the underlying paradigms, the language, the imaginaries, the logics of the Industrial Revolution. Last year I showed a work at the Museo Santa Monica called It Will Happen Here. In this case, it was called It Will Happen Here in Barcelona. The work is different in every city it is shown because it's a database film. Into this film, I've collected images filmed in different industrial shores. And when I came to Barcelona, I filmed along the shores of Barcelona. And it uses data. When I filmed in Philadelphia, it concerned particularly the data of contaminants that will be in the water from all of the petrochemical industries that are in the flood zone. When I came here to Barcelona, I worked with some members of the park system to learn about animals that were becoming extinct through the changing temperatures, through the human development of landscapes along the coast, and we added extinctions. In each place that the work is shown, it has a different data set. It involves different local conditions, local issues of pollution, local issues of extinction, local kinds of issues of water levels, and this influences how the film plays. I'm going to start with a short example of this piece. The piece is a collaboration that comes from these research elements and is worked through in image, in text, and in sound. I worked with a computational poet, Nick Mumford, and a composer, Adam Vidixis. And when the work is shown, the text streams to create constantly changing language around the topic of climate change that draws from my observations and from the scientific data that we're collecting. Here, for example, you see the text streaming over a performer and the audience of the chemical contaminants in the Delaware River around the Sunoco oil refinery. The first sample will just show a little bit about how the work is installed. If it's possible to turn the lights, that would be great. illustration of how it was set up. Gives you a little bit of an idea of the initial structure. From a streaming band of text are extracted generatively words that attempt to describe what is fundamentally impossible to describe. These abstract big concepts of water, floods, catastrophe, annihilation. These are very abstract terms that are so hard to put words to. And yet we have something else, which is actually the experience of time itself, the flow, the movement, the sensation of being out on the water, and how to translate that rich sense of sensation and perception of an embodied relationship to the water when words fail us. We know a lot of facts about impending crises, but facts enough don't change behavior. The arts offer a point of contact, a point of emotional contact, and a point of embodiment of these concepts. How to do that is, in a way, the challenge we're trying to take on. How to create an environment where there is an emotional internalization, a transformation of one's imagination, the creation of imaginaries. In the showing of this work, we've often done it with live musical performance. The music is also generative, and the audience moves with the musicians as they perform to something that is always changing. It's a generative work. The musicians don't know what will happen. And so life is an improvisation. The music is an improvisation. The audience, which is sometimes on stage with the musicians, has to move about and follow the text and the sound as the piece moves from screen to screen. The audience becomes like a wave moving among the images. They're caught up, being pulled this way and that in something that is bigger than themselves. And in that process, an audience must make choices. Choice making is one of the aspects of emerging arts, to me, that's very important. That is an aspect that has long been missing from cinema. In cinema, you have no choice. The film comes at you in one direction. Our relationship to installations, to fragmented cinema, is one of choice. How to select and gather, how to build a relationship to the materials. There are several aspects of the 19th century logic of images and the power of the images to provide evidence that I find important to draw into question, and that new technologies are helping to do this. One is the panorama, the 19th century concept of seeing the world as a whole, which builds upon a Renaissance concept of perspective, in which the person is the center of vision and, in a way, the center of the universe. The panorama, the old 19th century panorama, was a building that created that sense, a 360 image, and you stood in the middle watching the world around. Although the world around, although seamless, in fact, usually those paintings had a lot of anomalies because they would show events happening in different places that couldn't all happen at the same time. And in fact, they compressed a distorted time, and they usually distorted space. This is something that new technologies like VR and immersive media environments that are 360 exploit, because in this space now you can open up the seamless whole to have very different kind of worlds behind, to describe the imagined worlds that we inhabit that can be squeezed away by these authoritative worlds of media. Disrupting the time flow of cinema using database systems can help break up that predictability of cinema. You don't know what's coming next, and you have to make choices. The 19th century stereoscope, the sense of seeing in perspective, and that the world that is two images gels nicely to be a single picture of the whole. Very common in landscape media. I did quite a few projects on old stereoscope images and rivers. And the way that VR, which also works with two images squeezed together, allows all sorts of ways to distort that by playing with the container that uses a mesh that is meant to make unity, but in fact can be used to expose the gaps. And as we were looking at in that brief sample, the power of the 19th century ticker tape or telegram, the messages that come in text, that come and come and come like the stock market, never stops, never stops, never stops, the stream of text. Out of that sense of never stopping, how can we actually stop and have a sense of self, our own voice in a text that is always going faster than we are? So using VR and interactivity is one of the ways to break open that 360 environment, to give the user choice in the panorama of how to select a narrative. For example, this is a project called Hearts and Minds that we did in a large-scale 360 space, like a panorama, except here the space is interactive. And the interactivity allows one to enter into memories. This entering into memories is very important for my current work on the North Shore and the North Sea, and I'll talk a bit about that a little bit later on. Let me just give you an example of how this works from this project that was made in 2014 about the Iraqi war and how soldiers revisit memories of the war when they've returned home. It's a film about war abuse, human rights abuse, and living with those abuses, and how those memories aren't there in the current landscape, but they reside in objects, in triggers to the past, which is something I'm very interested in now in climate change, is how in erased landscapes we will also find triggers, objects that signal the past, the way we find in ruins also the hidden stories of the past. Let me show you a very brief sample.
During the first deployment, when we just sort of rolled into Baghdad and people were taking down statues and cheering and everything, you really had a sense that this was going to turn into a humanitarian mission, that we were really there to win hearts and minds. We were going to build something. But some of the guys had a saying from Vietnam, "Let me win your hearts and minds or I'll burn your damn huts down." And one of my drill sergeants used to say, when you want to finish someone, when you're clearing bodies in the fields, that's how you do it. 1 in the heart, 2 in the mind. People get cynical like that.
There was a lot of a lot of aggression in our platoon. We go out on patrol, and sometimes if something had happened, it would be like, fuck it. If there's a sniper, we wouldn't know where it was coming from. We would just do all directional shooting, firing at anything that moves, like in a video game. Everything is a target. Stop thinking of them as people. We raided this pharmacy early on, and I had assumed that we were going to go, come out with some opiates or something. And would, spend the rest of the year comatose with the stuff. But instead, they come out with vials and vials of steroids. And so the whole platoon got on steroids. And then, when you get a hold of a guy, a prisoner, sometimes you would start doing something and just kind of lose track. One time we caught this guy right as he was planting an IED on the road, right in fucking front of us. We got him in the Humvee, and we just took turns carving stuff. Stars, smiley faces, whatever. Our initials in his face. Just to leave him with some scars that, would never go away. And at one point, I peeled back the skin of his face, just to see what was under there. His jaw muscles and teeth and tongue and shit. Just a lot of blood. I just spaced or something and went into this zone and kept peeling. And he was moaning and making this awful noise. And after that, we were like, fuck it, we're not taking him back. Nobody's gonna process him. Who wants to explain that? So we drew straws, and one of us shot him in the side of the head with a drop weapon, and we dumped him on the road. Ran him over, and that was that. We just headed back to the base.
Interactivity as a means to break open the stories, but also to give space to listen. I worked a lot in this case with a political scientist who had done the interviews. And we talked about making a movie, but the feeling was a movie would go too fast. And sometimes to take in information, you need to stop the speed, stop the ticker tape, stop the action, sit, contemplate, and then make a choice. The other thing we talked about is how the surface can seem benign, a plain, domestic home, yet kind of strange in its animated space. But very small things trigger big memories. The way that small fossils are all we have to triggers to distant pasts. Or if we imagine a future archaeology, which is something I'm very interested in now, of places that we know that will disappear, what will be the remnants that trigger the stories of how we inhabited those lost shorelines? How will those lost shorelines speak to us across time? How will they come back into our new spaces? That project is an example of using interactivity and choice. Working with data systems, there's a second aspect, is chance. In film, there's no chance, everything is in order. But with the data system, always changing what goes with what. The story is always changing. How do we interpret what we are told with what we see? This is a big problem for the knowing things about, say, climate change and going out to the beach and seeing everything is lovely and not having trouble to connect the two. In the project Toxicity, and now the recent projects of the floods, the altering shores, the water here, and so on, this set of projects began with a series of kayak trips I did on industrial shores along the Delaware River and then the Thames, beginning in 2011, around the time of some big hurricanes, looking at the development of the shores and the industrialization, and we're asking what will happen as these areas flood. We used, in this case, for Toxicity a narrative structure using a database where the clips, the stories would always change. These were, as it were, oral histories from the future. People describing life in a future time, and they were set against actual stories of how people died during Hurricane Sandy that had just happened. This example is very short of a long film. The normal film, is about 50 minutes, and after 50 minutes, the whole system refreshes and it makes a new film with beginnings, middles, and ends. It's a way to tell a story where no one story is complete. Every sequence points to resolution before, like the tides, everything is washed up again and we have a new story. Here's a little example of how that feels.
I used to come out this way to try and catch fish. I pulled perch, striped bass, a lot of good eating fish. Nowadays, of course, with the contaminants, they say it ain't safe. I never know what to believe. It's a powerful river, can wash a lot of stuff away. Not right now, of course. I mean, look at it. After a hurricane, there was no point in fishing with all the sewage and debris. So what am I doing here? I ain't fishing for fish. I aim to get some furniture. Now, most of your contemporary pieces, like that recliner there, are useless when you pull them out. But a lot of folks around here had antiques, period pieces, stuff they got handed down. Yesterday, I pulled out a captain's chair, must be 200 years old. And once these people come out of the camps, back into the high ground settlements, once they start to rebuild, they're going to be looking for furniture, you know? I figure it's like a harvest in a way. Once the stuff dries out, it doesn't smell so bad. Sanded, new coat of furnish, like new again. Get lemons, make lemonade.
They still name the storms. Hurricane Danny, Tropical Storm Erica, Hurricane Fred. They recycle the list every 6 years, but they retire the names of particularly memorable storms, like Tess and Benjamin. They've been retiring a lot of them the last few years. I was down in Toms River supervising a cleanup operation for Hurricane Marco when Omar hit and flooded the Schuylkill. It was a strange path, and people didn't expect that it would hit the Philly metro area the way that it did. My boy's school was in the path. The roof of the cafeteria caved in and he was trapped under a beam. They were able to save him, but it impacted his spine, fractured in 3 places. He'll never walk again. It's difficult.
People knew that it was likely that Bayonne, surrounded by the Newark Bay, the Kill Van Kull, and the New York Bay, would flood and lose power. But Alice, born in Bayonne in 1926, stayed in her home. She slipped while using the bathroom in the dark, struck her head on the doorknob and fell to the floor, where she died and was found 5 days after the storm struck.
By the mid-teens, nearly everyone agreed that spending on FEMA was way out of control, and that they needed to be put on a leash. I mean, the whole budget can't be disaster relief when you've got 4, 5, 6 canes tearing up the coast every year. You can't bail everyone out every time a storm hits. Sometimes it's like tough luck, you know? You should have built on high ground, right? They ran out of other people's money, and then they ran out of trailers. They ran out of rations, and that's when things really got complicated.
Each time the film plays, it begins to gather these characters who tell more and more of the time unfolding, this future, near future time, telling about their experiences, while we have this chorus of stories of different deaths. It, say, draws on maybe 3 hours of material to make a 1-hour film, and then another one, each with different combinations of the images and the language, the people, so that you begin to build up the sense of all these lives. We're all in this mix together, but the stories sometimes work out well and sometimes don't. There's no one end, and in fact, one has to hold on to what bits you can, gather from the tides, gather points of resilience, gather a position before it's gone and something else takes place. The project, and this has led now to I'm going to come back to my current projects, was based on extensive historical mapping, thinking about how we live on the residue of past times and what our current world will look like as residue for future times. And these observations, which I have from my own walks and kayaking and from historical studies, were coupled with various collaborations on changes taking place, on contaminants found in the soils and things like that, and layered onto in a way, a visual environment, maps, data, recordings. It involved making interactive maps. This is a map of 300 sites I created of chemical contamination in a flood zone of less than 2 meters by the river. The map became the base for self-guided interactive art tours where you could take a kayak or walk along sites. And as you did that, you would use a book, a guide that I created, moving along these environments, following notes from the paths, following descriptions of the local environment, impact on species, impact on land, and the chemical or industrial history. The idea was to create locations, which we did, along the industrial shores where you would confront images of transformation. You have the place as it is, the place as it was, and the place as it might be, all crunched together. We created 360-degree film experiences for people as they were walking, and sites where you could put on VR headsets to plunge into an alternative experience of the place you were standing in, to disrupt the present as it is, and to clash or combine that present with different kinds of pasts or different kinds of futures. Here's a brief example of a piece designed for a headset. Oh, I should show this one on yeah. Hold on a second. This is in VR, so I need to show it directly with okay. Recently, I've been walking along the shores of Kent in the north of France, the Opal coast. In the works you've been watching, I've been very interested in this sense of the horizon line, what we see above and what lives below, and particularly in my walks along the north shore of France and the south shores of England, the kind of exchange that moves across the water, over the surface and underneath. Jules Verne, the great fiction writer of the 19th century, was from the north coast of France. And in his books, one of the achievements of Verne was to go way up above on a balloon in 80 days around the world, down beneath the water in 20 leagues under the sea, to begin to stretch our sense of perspective on this horizon of the water and our relationship, our physical relationship to things very big and very small, and to create points of contact. How do we connect spaces that seem far away? He was writing from the Opal coast of France under the white cliffs at Haute. The mirror image here is of a village I grew up in the south coast of England, in Kent, that will disappear with rising waters, as will many villages around the world for many people. And looking to the waters, one asks, how does this knowledge begin to change one's relationship to living by the water, and a relationship to the past and the future? How will our present landscapes be viewed as an archaeology in the future? The process is one that involves looking back at different kinds of ruins from the past, ruins that mark the shorelines, Saxon castles, World War II ruins, or future ruins. These are sound walls built to listen to the sounds of incoming airplanes during World War II, to listen to the reverberations, the echoes across the water. This notion of echo across time, echo across water, echo between humans and nature's central theme for this next aspect of thinking, how do we cross waters? How do we cross that horizon line above and below? And how do we understand the different kinds of movements that occur? Movements of language, explanation, things we can explain, and things that don't have language. Movement and echo as vibration, as different kinds of migration, as the sense of time itself, the way it moves on us, the way water moves, not the way a clock moves. As we come now to the very end of my talk, I'm going to just show one more brief sample from the It Will Happen Here project. And in this sample, we will be a sequence that was filmed, underwater sequence, that is gathering images of memory underwater. books I've been showing today are large-scale installations designed for public spaces. They're built on various kinds of explorations of landscapes, of shorelines in particular. And they're works that are designed to bring in, to in a way create a gulf between language, image, sound, to try and give the space for the public to position themselves between different kinds of information, to grab what they can from the flow that is sometimes the flow that is in a way fast, sometimes hard to grasp it all as it is in life. And that out of that, there are certain brief moments of narrative, brief moments of observation, of realization, and an attention to particular objects, particular markers from which you can begin to build your own stories. That is, like the remnants of archaeology of the past, to create an art that provides people with the elements to build the stories and not just a prepackaged whole. To break apart the panorama, to break apart the linear narrative, to break apart the ticker tape or telegram, and instead give a way to reinterpret the data, reinterpret the information in a context that's emotional, that is about building memory and creating stories for the future. And to use art to enable people the tools to begin to do that, to not feel helpless in the face of the contemporary conditions of big crises, of climate change, of extinction, but rather to give people, in a way, a space to grasp hold of the elements and to participate in a building process. Okay, thank you. I think we can take some questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roderick. It was very inspiring. We really think we really got the flow and the transdisciplinarity of your work. So for me, it was amazing. So, any question in the room?
Thank you, Roderick. It was very inspiring. I just make a comment, no? Just to break the ice. No? I think it's great to see that despite the hour and the day that we are so many people here and other people connected probably, and this is I believe because we all feel that science is a very restricted view of our world. No? The world is much more than data and quantitative ideas. No, we all feel that, and being a scientist, above all, you are an artist. No, you try to interpret nature. No, interpreting nature is much more than gathering data and trying to describe that data. You realize that there's much more. No, there are all these connections. No, that are beyond quantitative standards. No. And all these are interior and external connections. No? And all what you've been explaining resonates with me so much because all this fluidity that you explain, all these echoes, all this resonance, no, to me is at the heart of connection. No? And connection is basically all these sort of things that we hardly describe. No? How we connect with ourselves, how we connect with nature, how we connect with entities, I mean living organisms or whatever they are, no? How all this is part of this fluidity and all this resonance, you know? And this, just as a comment again, it brings me to this concept that to me is very, very, very important at the heart of everything is empathy, no? Mm-hmm. Empathy is, to me, such a strong concept, no? It's so beautiful, no? Because it's what really resonates. You connect with everything because you feel that both cognitively and effectively you are part of so many more things. No? So all these things that you've been explaining to me are very wonderful, no? Because is this resonance, these connections, and I see it as an opportunity, because it's an opportunity to as scientists go beyond and project into this empathy that is a new world, this utopia that you were explaining. So thank you very much.
Empathy is very tied to that difference between history and memory. Not history as a static thing, not data as a static thing, not just the text. But those things matter, but they have to, how do we bring them back into the folds of a living memory? Memory is something that's always changing. You're always drawing on the old to explain the new. When you dream, you don't dream in clear historical narratives. You pick from when you were 5 and when you were 12 and what you might be doing when you're 90, and it all mixes together in a field of memory. And that should be the same too for scientific information. It creates arguments which are essential, arguments for the court of law, for government, for making laws, but also the data that becomes a thing of memory. How do we actually live our lives is empathy. It's the emotional relationship to the facts because they're internalized and living, not fixed in a graph. And that's, in a way, part of the role of the artist in collaborating with the science, is to how to create those fields of empathy and those fields where you have a living memory of the materials that are beyond fact.
Any other question, comment? Well, it made me thought a lot, not your presentation, and I was just thinking when we have activities, for example, with children, we like to ask, so what do you think when you think about the sea? And it's very interesting because it's at the same time inspiring as a relaxing and leisure place, but as well it's a threatening place. And I think in the historical period we've been playing with that. We've been inspired by the sea. We had to respect it because it was like really a big threat, and then we had this conquering idea of we can dominate the sea, and now we are a bit back and forth at this flow you are describing so well, no? That the sea is threatening us as well, despite our technology, as you are talking about technology. So I think this flow is just very interesting, and I really like the way I feel you are translating it.
Thanks. It's one of the things I'm hoping to learn from you, and maybe you will have some thoughts for me. I feel that there is in trying to translate that, my children right now, and I think it's very common for the whole generation, are rather worried about climate change and feel rather helpless. And partly I feel that is out of it's all too big. And how do we connect then to things that are much more specific kinds of movement? That's why I'm right now interested in this notion of, well, how do we, in a way, see what's invisible? Like how do we see under the water, in fact? Not just in a underwater movie sense, but how do we feel that vibration? How do we play with a concept like the concept of sound or reverb? How do we see things that are very small, like plankton or viruses that move or bacteria that moves or seaweed, and things that are and resonates from coast to coast and moves in a way that is different, that creates a different sense of movement that maybe can help build a resilience to rising waters, to climate change, instead of a fear. Also, how do we adapt? Because it's now too late to stop a lot of the things that will happen. We have to learn to live in a very different way with the changes, to build in a way a different relationship, to provoke perhaps a long-term sustainability, but also to learn to adapt and to set things in motion now, to set ways of talking about the water, feeling our relationship to shorelines that will prepare for what's a very changing future. That's a kind of an intimate relationship to children, in fact. You need to learn young, and I make works for public spaces a lot because it's about how do we relate in very public spaces, and to things that are very big and very small. And also, therefore, the scale of art matters a lot. It can be really great to look at something very small, like on a cell phone, and then suddenly very big. And you have a very different relationship to these things, a different empathetic relationship to the miniature and to the grotesque. And part of the stories of climate change is that these small events and then this sudden catastrophe. I've been thinking about that, say, for metaphors of that, things that are very small communications in the water and vast communications across space. For example, sending signals to echo back to see how space communication works to extend our relationships, that it's not just on the flat horizon of human perspective, but we are integrated with what's under the water or under the ground and with what's above us. And how do we create that relationship so we feel part of something bigger and not just the daily junk that comes on the phone all the time? So that's, again, a very important, I think, for everyone working in each, one can feel very isolated in one or another field, is how each person's story can connect, as it were, that we're not all submerged in this corner or that. Again, that's one of the roles of the arts, is how to create spaces for that kind of connection where people can plunge in and pull out stories and in a way gather, whether it's gathering from knowledge or gathering from personal experience, to begin to make that network of memories. So I hope that this gives some ideas, maybe some ways of working. For me, the creative process is always a mix of research and creative storytelling, using maps as a way of making a story, of making an argument, using maps as a tool of walking and imagining, thinking of movement, not just horizontally but vertically, and gathering in a way a 3D model that is perspective that is as like the worlds of VR, above and below and in all directions, not just the flat horizon. And that in that sort of, that it gathers this changeable material, that as you're going, the world is always changing because you are always changing. So how do you gather things in a way, collect material, and that's what the data set and working with data arts does, is it keeps gathering, reinterpreting that material in a new context, making living memory out of something fixed. So all of those strategies become ways of initiating a project, even if at the end you just end up with a photograph. It's just the tip of something that is a process. And I think for education now as a teacher, especially with AI, for example, where you don't, the finished paper means nothing because anyone can get a finished paper from artificial intelligence. What matters is finding a route to the process of writing or the process of investigation, the process of exploring, and to find other ways to return to that process where the real learning happens and the real vibrance happens, and how that little thing at the end, the picture, the paper, can take us back into a process, which is the process all of you do in your own different ways, that is actually the magical thing, right? And to share the process is the hardest thing of all.
Yeah, I think, well, we have more time to talk about all that between today and tomorrow, but it's something we think a lot, the difference of like horizontality. Most of people see the sea as just a shoreline and the leisure space and don't think about it in a 3D idea. And we study the sea in a vertical way. We study water column. So it's just the opposite way of thinking. And so how to reconnect and to have all this 3D image is very interesting. And so we study it from this very tiny microscopic scale until satellite. So all these scales are hard to integrate, and I think art is a key element to help. Any other common idea? Yeah.
Thank you, Roderick, for your talk. I didn't know your work, so it's always a very nice experience to learn about the new practices. And I've noticed that sound, as you mentioned, is very important in your work in order to create memories, right, with images. And also you mentioned the notion of maps, how important they are for you. And you mapped these points of chemicals, right, in these industrial areas. And I wonder if, making a link with this idea of the sea as something 3D, and the notion of pollution, you've thought about making projects, you already have them perhaps, of data from the sound pollution, and how this affects the underwater life, that we're not aware of it, but it's so present. So just, as a comment
there
like
were
that.
so many, I know during COVID, when they said with all the ships stopped during COVID, and suddenly you could hear a whole different soundscape under the water, the distance that sound signals would travel from whales, for example. The element of soundscape is part of my next project. That's what I'm... the dominant theme of the next project, not just sound, but other vibration in a broader sense that includes sound reverberations, but also vibrations that you feel. Vibrations you don't quite hear but are in the soundscape, or vibrations that are like the signals sent from satellites that bounce. Different things that vibrate that are about our relationship to a physical moving in the world that we are hearing in more ways than just the ears. The way that when you dance, you feel music too, or swim and you feel the ocean. So the soundscape is very important for that, and particularly I'm also interested in that, yes, how different kinds of signal come through vibration beyond, in a way, beyond human language. Because sound speaks to us in many ways, tone speaks to us, mood, the soundscapes speak to us, not with words, but they speak in something else. And we're very ill-equipped to understand in a way the communication between species, human to species communication, species to species, machine to species. One of the pieces we did involves hydrophones under the water that would drive the data experience above the water. And so those ones where you walk along the shore, and we had microphones in the water that would alter based on the soundscapes under the water and the tidal movements. And it had a second data element coming in that had to do with pollution. And then that would change what you would see. So this visual images, all going crazy suddenly, or things happening, would be a visual representation of what you couldn't in fact hear because it's underwater, but it gets translated into something else. And that process of translation is in a way essential to a lot of what's happening here, which is how do you take things that are invisible or inaudible and make them into a form that humans can use to communicate. So it's very exciting to me, and that's very much my next area. I'd love to talk more about it. And that's why I showed, I think, a couple images of those sound walls, because that's part of this gathering of different ways we gather and hear things that we can't hear directly. So I'd like to hear more about why you had the question. Maybe you're working on that too.
No,
okay.
Maybe you can introduce
Yeah,
yourself.
no, I just work with a foundation that works with artists that actually mix science, art, and ecology. And as we work with many artists, and some of them are very much interested in underwater pollution, and so just seeing your work or your presentation and this idea of mapping, it made me wonder, if sound, especially sound pollution, underwater sound pollution, had a role in your work. So, I'm not an artist myself. But.
Okay. Any other questions?
First of all, thanks for coming here. I had a very specific question, okay? So, what do you think about the dark matter, like the, I don't know how to say it in English, but la materia negra? Okay, so it's something that we don't know about it, and it's everywhere, and we can see it, we can touch it, we can feel it. So I just wanted to know what you think about it.
As to talk metaphorically about dark matter, there's a concept of the inchoate in English. I'm not sure the translation. The unimaginable, the unreachable, the untouchable, the invisible. And the we may not reach in human consciousness the ability to understand dark matter, but what we do have is, in a sense, that other side of the mirror, the thing you can't see that you feel is there. The emotion that you have a nervous response, a physical response to something around you, but you can't tell what it is. Those aspects, what, in a way, there's two concepts of Walter Benjamin, when he talked about the optical unconscious and innovation, is the point of actually where technology helps us see a gap between what we can feel or see and what is else out there. And that's another, that the sense that there's so much of the world and so much exterior of the world is unreachable, just the way that so much of the interior world of the imagination is unreachable. As an artist, one looks for how to describe what is unreachable inside, to connect things that seem impossible to connect. And as an artist, a concept of the dark matter, or the thing you can't grasp, is at least as a metaphor very valuable for also talking about the things internally, the unconscious elements of the imagination, the collective unconscious, what it is that binds us, that is invisible to us, from which we can capture just reverberations or mirror images from askance, but you can't hit directly. In fact, there are very few things that make sense directly. Most things you can only find by some obscure route, by some mirror, where you break apart that illusion of the reality, the surface, and then you see something has a different meaning, a different hidden story. That's the best I can do as an artist on the topic. But it's a very important topic, and with it, the concept. Thank you. Good question.
Hi, thanks a lot for your talk. I was wondering, based on your experience, how effective do you think that using dystopian images is when trying to create this empathy and awareness on climate change? Because I feel there's a lot of use of these dystopian resources in sci-fi movies, and we are very numb currently to these violent and over-aggressive images in our daily lives. So do you think it's still an effective resource?
You're right, we're overwhelmed by dystopian images, and there is a way in which things get lumped together as a general mood of dystopia, which isn't helpful for building resilience, but it is it expresses a dominant fear, a kind of end-of-times fear that the climate change narratives and mass extinction narratives present. So how do you, in that, create resilience out of the ruins? Because, in fact, we do live with the ruins of the 19th and 20th century industry, and those ruins keep making more ruins. So we have a landscape of ruins, so we also have a landscape of Roman ruins, maybe the first creators of the Anthropocene, the first the people to use water systems, to reclaim land, use irrigation, to change nature, to transform landscapes. But of course, so much more devastating with the petrochemical revolution of the 19th century. So how do we talk about those ruins in other ways? That is, how do we build a resilience or a future out of that? And that's where I've been focusing a lot on this notion of different kinds of ruins all compressed together, so that from that we actually build new kinds of landscapes to find some other way of treating that material where I come across it. because they are these, in a way, we have these palaces of the logic of industrialization that are the remnant of this, will be the remnant of this epoch 100 years from now, that tell a story. But that story is one of many stories, at that point will be one of many stories. So how do we bring together in a way, this flood of dystopian images of today with images of other times and make sense of it in a broader history, as opposed to right now it feels like just a flood of dystopia. But that's a short-term flood. In the longer term, they are among a bigger arc of stories. If it were, one choral moment of a bigger orchestra, how do we place something past that dystopia and put those dystopian images in a containment, in a moment, in a data set moment. For example, this particular project, every 30 to 90 seconds, it changes its data structure and set of images. Well, how do you contain, in a way, those dystopian images, for example, into a data set, that collection, that tells its story but is contained within some other story, so we can reframe the narratives? That's the way I'm trying to deal with it, trying to think over those pictures in a way to map arcs of time that contain and address it, because it's still very important, the fear, the loss, the emptiness. And we go by these old abandoned factories all the time, and the old abandoned homes and abandoned villages and places that have been destroyed by different forces. And the simple narratives aren't satisfying enough. I agree with your question. So how else do we reframe those, but not deny them? It's also there. I think probably we should wrap up, right?
Yes, if there's comments on questions.
Great, thank you.